without any further ado, I would like to introduce Story Clayton and the fourth place nationally ranked Rutgers Debate Union, who will debate what we should do about this problem. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you everyone for coming out here tonight. It's really great to see so many people engaged and excited about something that's obviously very pressing to your future and to the future of really everyone on the planet. So tonight, I'm just going to give you a few remarks about what you're going to see here to help you understand this debate for the class or for whatever interest you're out here for. We're going to have a 45-minute debate. It's going to be featuring 6 total individuals, as you see here on my right and left. This is going to be the government team, and this is going to be the opposition team, and each team consists of 2 distinguished student debaters and 1 distinguished professor at Rutgers, who I'll introduce in a moment. And the format that you're going to see here is based on something that we call parliamentary debate. So there's a few things that you should know about that. First of all, the speeches are going to go basically in sequence where government and opposition alternate. Government and opposition, we just call it that. Government proposes the resolution and opposition opposes it. And the resolution tonight, again, is that Rutgers University ought entirely divest from fossil fuels to combat climate change, which is basically stemming exactly from Monday's talk from Bill McKibben about his advocacy. So government will be representing that advocacy and opposition will be opposing it. So the first 2 speeches will be sort of constructing the main lines of argumentation. The next 2 will refute the arguments as they've been presented, and then the last 2 will sum up the case for both sides. And government has the privilege, since they have the harder side, they have a position which they're advocating, which is a change of both going first and going last. So there will be some mix-up in the alternation where opposition will get 2 speeches in a row and government will close the debate. So let me introduce the participants in tonight's debate. So in the position of Prime Minister on the government, giving the opening speech is R.B. Laveshi, who is a junior in the School of Arts and Sciences in his 5th semester of debate at Rutgers. And he's a participant of several public debates, including last year's Project Civility debate and this year's Constitution debate, which he was on the winning team for. And he represented Rutgers at national championships last year. He will be followed, opening for the opposition, by Quinn Mangy, who is a sophomore, majoring in economics and is the debate union's treasurer. And last year, he was the 3rd ranked first-year or novice debater in the league in the entire nation and is currently part of the 18th ranked partnership in the entire nation. And he's also on pace to qualify for nationals as he did last year. Then, speaking for the government, 3rd will be Professor David M. Hughes, who is the undergraduate director of the anthropology department in the School of Arts and Sciences. He holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of California at Berkeley and currently directs the Center for African Studies at Rutgers, as well as serving as a professor in the Department of Human Ecology. Speaking 4th and taking up the refutation for side opposition will be Sean Leonard, and he is a freshman at the School of Arts and Sciences in his 2nd semester of debate and currently stands as the 4th ranked novice of the year in the entire nation and is on pace to qualify for nationals. And then closing for the opposition right behind him will be Professor Bruce Mizrak, who is a professor in the Department of Economics. He has held appointments at Boston College, the Wharton School, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and the NYU Stern School of Business. And he also is the founder and editor of Studies in Nonlinear Dynamics and Econometrics, a quarterly journal published by the MIT Press. And finally, we'll hear in closing for the government from Bhargavi Sriram, who is a senior double majoring in finance and psychology, a former vice president of the debate union who co-directed last year's tournament, which was the largest intercollegiate debate competition ever held at Rutgers. And she also represented Rutgers at the national championships and has been on the winning team in the last 2 Constitution Day debates. So the last thing about the format that you should know beforehand, sort of the most fun thing about our format, and we will also have brochures, by the way. If you're interested in joining the debate team, it's free for anyone to join. So if you like what you see here and you want to participate, come get a brochure. We'll sign you up and we can talk to you about what the expectations of the debate team are. It's a lot of fun. All of these people started out as people who had no public speaking experience at some point, and we trained them. But the last thing about the format that is the most fun is the questions. So some debate formats have an actual cross-examination period where people ask each other questions directly. It's a little more on the fly. So people ask what are called points of information, and they indicate that they want to ask that by rising out of their chair and making this funny gesture. So, and that doesn't mean that the speaker up here has to accept their question. They can wave them down or say no thank you, but at least once per speech in the 4 opening speeches, they're expected to take that question. And this tradition of standing like this in this goofy way comes from the parliamentary debates themselves, where the long, flowy white wigs that you may have seen in history textbooks were worn by all the parliamentarians, and they would fly out of their seats so quickly with a question or a refutation that if they did not hold their wigs down, they would fly off of them. So we still pay homage to that and make this sort of goofy gesture. So people will be standing or making that gesture in this particular situation. So without further ado, I would like to call it, huh?
Those questions can come from the audience?
No, the questions, thank you for that question. The questions will be coming from the speakers themselves, but that is a good reminder that you will all be invited to join the debate at the end of this. So we will have the 6 speeches, the 45-minute debate, and we have the microphone front and center. So at the conclusion of the debate, we will have people line up if they want to ask a question or make a comment or add to the debate themselves, address a question to the panelists, and you'll definitely be more than welcome to do that. So that will be at the end of the debate. At first, it will just be people questioning each other who are up here. So without further ado, I call this House to order and invite the Right Honorable Prime Minister, R.B. Laveshy, to open the round on the resolution that Rutgers University ought entirely divest from fossil fuels to combat climate change.
Hear, hear.
Here.
Thank you, Story, for your wonderful introduction, and Dean Turpin for making our case for us. First of all, we're going to talk about a few things today. We're going to talk about 3 fundamental reasons as to why Rutgers should change its investment policies. Now, when we talk about divestment, just to clarify for everyone here, we're not talking about shutting down all of Broward and all of the power in the school until we can only get clean energy. We're talking about when Rutgers uses its endowments to finance returns in the future. So it can buy things like stocks or part of companies such as Exxon or BP or Chevron in order to actually make gains in the future. We're saying that Rutgers should not participate in buying from these fossil fuel companies, and we have 3 fundamental reasons. Today we're going to talk about why it's a moral obligation to do so, why it is a fundamental stance of leadership and standard setting, and why ultimately it's a good investment in the long term. So let's talk about our moral obligations. I'd like to say that ultimately the effects of climate change are and have been hurting us to this very day. In 2011, Irene hit us. It was a $16.6 billion hit in damages, and there were numerous individuals dead whose lives were irreplaceable. In 2012, Sandy hit us, causing, under Governor Christie's estimates, $37 billion in damages and 37 individuals dead. Now, what is the fundamental truth behind all of these events? There have been massive amounts of climate change undergoing, which has started these storms, and which has harmed individuals in New Jersey, but not only New Jersey, across the globe. We've had massive droughts in the Midwest and large crop failures because of our continued investment and usage of fossil fuels. And ultimately, we've had numerous reports from international accredited agencies, such as the International Energy Agency, which published the World Energy Outlook in November 2012. And what did it say? For every $1 that we withhold in investment from things such as renewables such as solar, hydro, or wind, we will pay $4.14 in or by 2020 or after 2020 if we do not invest. What's the problem here? The problem here is that we're harming lives indirectly, and even though financing things such as fossil fuel companies might be in the short-term benefit of Rutgers, ultimately individuals in state institutions and families are paying for it. Sure.
So, Arby, it's still always going to be profitable for some company to have holdings in these fossil fuels, right, though? Isn't it better then that Rutgers University gets them and uses them to finance student aid instead of just going in the pockets of greedy hedge fund managers?
So look, at the end of the day, we're saying that financing student aid is cool, and I'm going to tell you why you're going to get a better return in the long term when you finance renewables such as solar. But why is this important, right? We have a moral obligation to the individuals who have lost their lives because we are indirectly harming them. We have a moral obligation to the enormous amount of damages that have been accrued because of our unrestrained investments. And we have a moral obligation to every single individual within this world, be it the individuals who suffered from flash floods in Bangladesh, the torrential rains in China, which have caused damage, or the immense amount of droughts in Brazil, which have lost many industries there. Why is this bad? Because at the end of the day, our actions aren't only harming ourselves, but they're harming others. And as citizens of the world, or individuals who encourage world citizenship, we should be aware of these harms, and we should be able to deal with them. Now, how will Rutgers have an impact in this? This leads me to my second major point, that Rutgers is actually a leader in this aspect, that it sets a standard through its actions. Look, before us, there have been only 3 colleges which have divested from fossil fuels. This is Sterling College, Hampshire College, and Unity College. I haven't heard of any of these places before, I was told about them, but apparently they exist. Here's the difference. Rutgers is a major institution. It's a state-funded institution which holds thousands of students as opposed to 300 in Unity College or something. The important thing to understand here is that we have a major impact. Where can we see colleges having major impact in the past through divestment? Apartheid and the socioeconomic changes that were caused by apartheid, the apartheid divestment, that ended the South African regime, were started through grassroots campaigns in colleges. Divestment ultimately created congressional shifts. It ultimately started to snowball in multiple colleges making these changes and started impacting the world through a broader scale. Even if they say that we have some economic incentive to finance our students, I would say that the impact that we could make by changing the world economically, but not only economically, but through a fundamental level by making it better, would outweigh any of that. We would tell you also that students are trendsetters and take their trends with them into the real world. When we stand as a green institution, not just a partially green institution that places solar panels as shade under our parking lots, but a fully green institution which actually is consistent, then we can actually maintain a firm standard, which doesn't actually just change the world, but invites professors who are very adamant about that to our schools, increases our standing worldwide, and puts us at the forefront of a large movement. The third and final thing that I'd like to talk about is why this is ultimately a good investment. And I think this is very obvious. In the long term, well, first of all, very quick, important point. The 2008 financial crisis was partially brought on by short-term investments made by colleges in order to actually render financial gain. These are the short-term investments they're trying to talk about that are going to make student loans better, but they're not stable and they're not sound. What is stable and sound is a long-term investment. And we see that long-term investments are much more beneficial in industries that are growing rapidly or that can grow rapidly. Here's the distinction. Usually, fossil fuel industries have stabilized. They're not growing industries. But renewable industries are newly growing every year. Extra energy produced last year was 31% by renewables. The year before that, it was 22%. The year before that, it was 11%. Why is this happening? Because this energy is continually growing cheaper, because this energy is continually easier to manufacture, and because ultimately these industries are growing much more rapidly. We would tell you that at the end of the day, it is a much better investment because it is a stable investment. This energy is not finite, unlike fossil fuels. There is no peak which individual investors consistently worry about, and there is no freaking campaign against it and interest in divesting from it. It is a very stable industry which individuals have interests to grow in, and we would encourage investment in it because it would create much greater returns. Therefore, we are happy to propose this resolution.
I thank the Speaker for his remarks, and now call the Honorable Leader of the Opposition, Quinn Mackey, to open the case for side opposition.
Thanks, everyone. It's a true honor to be up here speaking in front of you on a topic that I do think will affect all of us in our lives. we're going to advance 3 major arguments on our side as to why this is an absolutely terrible policy before I go back to their arguments and show you why they're also ludicrous. The first thing I'm going to title, All Companies Are Icky. Walmart and Nike invest in sweatshops. Perrier is a massive producer of carbon wastes. Cracker Barrel actively lobbies against gay rights and refuses to hire anyone who has dwarfism. I think this pretty clearly demonstrates that no matter what company you pick out, no matter what that sort of company's agenda is, there is always something wrong with that agenda, and there is always a skeleton in the closet for it. Is the right answer then to say, we don't want any companies in our country? We don't want anyone to take these practices that might be harmful in the long term? I don't think that's reasonable. I think what is a much more reasonable policy is to say that we want to make sure that these guys have a zero-sum impact and actually have to internalize the externalities created by their costs. That when someone pollutes in carbon, they have to take on the cost to society by polluting in carbon, as we do with the carbon tax in 10 northeastern states on utilities already, or the other way you can offset this sort of carbon impact by investing in green technology, which, fun fact, big oil and oil companies are the biggest investor in green technology in the world right now. They invested $71 billion last year alone as compared to the 40-something billion of the United States government. Exxon and BP did a lot in biofuels, and if Arby wants to get up here and talk about solar power, Chevron invested a hell of a lot of money in that as well. At that point, these are the actual people who are directly funding and directly financing the green technology that is beneficial and giving us a zero-sum game in the future. But what does divesting do? Divesting sends the message that we think these companies are terrible and should not actually even exist. Listen to Arby's own rhetoric, where he tells you that these companies are polluting and ruining our future. At that point, I think the message that's sent is we should hit these companies over the head with a giant hammer instead of going in with a targeted scalpel and to target the actual harmful parts of their portfolios. But the second big argument I'm going to advance is going to be titled The Efficacy of Divestment. So in a 5-minute Google search, I managed to find 5 divestment campaigns. One for sweatshops, one for landmines, one for tobacco, one for Israel, and one for South Africa. Funnily enough, 4 of these never got anything done, and the one for South Africa only worked not because of some large financial impact on South Africa, but because South Africa had to cave to international pressure eventually because it's a government. But pretty clearly, I think big oil doesn't care what public opinion is about it. See, for example, that they've consistently had a disapproval rate around 60 to 70% and are always ranked the last of all of the major industries in our country, but they don't really change their practices or don't actually go off that differently. At that point, I think that just changing this doesn't have any efficacy, but let's talk about this movement specifically as well. It was founded in 2007, and Arby's like, there are only 3 schools here, including Sterling College, which has an endowment of less than $1 million and is specifically dedicated to environmental issues. At that point, I don't see this movement being particularly effective. Harvard just shut this down without giving a single reason. They just said no. Indiana and Penn State, also members of the Big Ten, refused to consider this, and people like Michigan has directly said that this sort of plan actually directly harms the people who are investing in the future instead. At that point, I don't think this movement is going to take off the ground regardless of what you do, and only has harms to companies. There are 3 possible things I think this can do to companies, though, if it has any impact. The first is that it raises their cost of capital across the board because you take money away from them. Why is that bad? Because people tend to be short-sighted in their investment schemes, so if their cost of capital goes up, they have to keep their profit margin at a similar level, so they're going to stop investing in green technology as a long-term investment, which we think is probably a bad outcome. We want to incentivize them to invest more in green tech. But even if you think that we're going to lower the stock price enough that it has an impact, then instead of us actually having some impact, what happens is some greedy hedge fund manager comes in and says that I am going to want to buy this stock because it is relatively cheap as compared to the long-term performance dynamics of it. At that point, I think that instead of having more student aid, instead of having more investment, instead of having things that are beneficial for the university, you just get money going to a greedy hedge fund manager. That's probably bad. Or the third possible possible outcome, they pull Adele and go private, which means we can't pressure them either. What's up?
Don't you think big oil would have a greater incentive to invest more than 5% of its total expenditures if we weren't buying their stocks anymore because they weren't green enough?
So funnily enough, the individual portfolio of Rutgers is less than $1 billion. Probably about 4% of it is invested in, let's see, ExxonMobil. And at that point, they individually don't have that much of an impact, and I don't think more people are going to join on for all of the empirics I pointed out earlier. But the third thing I'm going to talk about, I'm going to call harms to the endowment. So recognize that this has to be a significant devaluation of the endowment because professionals in hedge funds, professionals in mutual funds, people who want to invest in the future are the ones who make these decisions and invest. So clearly they probably know what they're doing. There's a reason it's in most mutual funds. But also recognize this prevents us from investing in most index fund and most mutual funds as well because everyone has some of ExxonMobil in their portfolio because they're like the second biggest company in the world. At that point, we don't think you can actually meaningfully divest except for just exposing yourself to significantly riskier assets and stuff that has a lot more long-term harms to you. I'm now going to review everything that they say. The first thing that they talk to you about, they call the moral obligation. They're like, climate change is bad. But what they're advocating is hitting companies over the head with a hammer instead of using a targeted scalpel to go in and cut out the parts of the companies that are bad and make them actually internalize the costs that they have to society. They say lots of people are harmed by it, and if we pay $1 now, it's $4.4 in 2020. But funny, I think that by the two things I showed you, either they have their cost of capital go up, which means they go to more short-term projects, or they stop doing long-term investment and a new person comes in who is just less vulnerable to public pressure. So either way, I think they end up decreasing investment anyways. The third thing they talk about is we are directly harming people, but like I told you, regardless of what Rutgers as an individual institution does, the same moral harm will always happen. We think it's better if those profits go to helping education, helping student aid, helping investment in the future of our students instead of just into the pocket of a hedge fund manager. The second thing they talk about is their impact. They say Rutgers will set the standard, and they talk about apartheid. That's funny. I think that someone like Harvard or a bigger college might have a slight impact, but Rutgers isn't even a top 100 endowment. We think that one university joining in isn't going to set this big of a message. This movement's existed for 5 years. There are chapters on 300 campuses, but only 3 have actually pledged. They're not going to get this. They say students will bring their visions into the futures. I just think that this is also silly. We say students should advocate. This is just a bad way to do it. The third thing they talk about is good investment. Basically, all of this boils down to alternative energy will be profitable in the future, which is exactly why we say you should use things like shareholder resolutions and pressure companies from the inside through your actual ownership to slowly invest in green energy. We think we need some sort of transition in our national ethos, be it gas, be it gasoline, be it whatever. They can't get pure divestment. We think all companies are icky and they send the wrong message. We oppose.
Feeling good?
I thank the speaker for his remarks, and now call the honorable member of the government, Professor David Hughes, to continue the case for side government.
All right, thank you very much. Let me start by addressing Quinn Menge's points here. He said all companies are icky, therefore we might as well lie in bed with them and get as icky as they are. He said that this movement would have no efficacy, and he seems to dislike hedge fund managers in some way and feels that we should distance ourselves from them by continuing to invest in the companies they push. I don't understand it all, but I'm going to refute it. Okay, the point that all companies are icky, let's take that one for granted. Let's take that one as given. I'm not going to sit up here and defend Walmart and sweatshops and so on. However, there is only one economic sector that poses an existential risk to this university, and that is the oil, gas, and coal sector, because their business plan involves burning enough hydrocarbons to raise the temperature and change the weather patterns of this planet enough to make a higher education a very difficult thing to pursue. Not to mention feeding yourself, a very difficult thing for millions of people to pursue. So I think this is a company, this is a sector that is so morally repugnant as to be an order of magnitude worse than the ickiness that Quinn wants to complain about. And it's bad for this university. Second point, on efficacy. So he cited, I think, the South African divestment campaign of the 1980s. It's a very good precedent. I think Quinn is reading it wrong. South African divestment did put pressure on universities and then raise the symbolic stakes and put pressure on the U.S. Congress, on the European Union and so on, to pass sanctions against South Africa. Sanctions which ultimately, all right.
So if big oil cares so much about public opinion against it, why don't they care that they're the most unpopular sector in our country for the past 25 years?
I don't think big oil cares about public opinion. I think this is about sending a message to our Congress and saying that our Congress should find this sector icky, should find this sector too icky to take its campaign contributions, and even if it takes its campaign contributions, find this sector too icky to invite into its private chambers and too icky to trade favors with. And that is about putting pressure on a government. So this is every bit like the South African divestment campaign, which was very successful. There are 234 campaigns at universities. 3 of them have succeeded. Quinn is showing his age by impatience. I'd say hang in there. Movements do not win overnight. Hedge fund managers will profit. I didn't quite understand that one. It's a dreadful thing that we need accountants and people with majors in finance and business school. People who've gone to business school manage the money of this university. I think they manage the money whether it's invested in solar or invested in wind or invested in fossil fuels or invested in sweatshops and prison camps. That's the way the business world works, and we're not actually debating that. Our points, to return to our points, which our Prime Minister, Arby, made very effectively. I don't really have much to add on the question of moral obligation. I think he said that very profoundly. This is a turning point for the United States and for the world. And I think it should be shameful for an institution of higher learning, for a scientific institution, to be on the wrong side of history here. That's all I have to say about moral obligation. In terms of our second point, that in the long term, fossil fuels are a bad investment, let me give you 2 investment scenarios. The business as usual scenario is that ExxonMobil and the other corporations, Arch Coal and so on, continue to produce and burn their product. And that raises the global surface temperature above 2 degrees centigrade before 2050, causing runaway climate change, causing unmodelable scenarios, which have all sorts of dreadful effects, make it difficult to farm in this country, and bring on a depression which will make the Great Depression look like, an empty piggy bank or something. And this is not, I'm not being unduly alarmist, this is what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change predicts, unmodelable scenarios past 2050. So, and in that case, any stock is not a good investment. Any currency is not a good investment if you're talking about a depression of this scale. So under scenario number 1, these are not good stocks to hang on to. Scenario number 2, which is the one I prefer, is that corporations, individuals, and universities all make the right choice, governments make the right choice, and we decarbonize, we move on to solar and renewable, we stabilize the climate, we make it possible to continue farming in Iowa, and important things like that. And in that case, we're not producing oil, gas, and coal, in which case stocks in Exxon and these other corporations are not a good investment. So, either way, on the positive side or on the negative side, this is not a good investment, right? Now, when you're faced with a sector you know is going to tank pretty soon, what do? Do you hang in there and say, well, geez, what's Harvard going to do because they're so prestigious and they've got almost the same colors as us? And what's Penn going to do? Oh, what's Sterling? But we don't believe them. No, they're too small. No, you don't wait around for others people. You dump the stock. Right? You want to dump something that's going to go down in value. You don't want to wait for other people to dump it first because then you lose. Okay, value, the leadership. Yes, this is incredibly important. We're too early to be the first, which I suppose is good because we're not sticking our necks out too far. But we have the potential to be the first public university, the first major university of any size to divest from fossil fuel companies. And we have a large student body. We have a large student body of very cool people. I know it. I teach them. I help make them cool. And I think this is an important symbolic step These are trendsetters, as our Prime Minister said, and I think we can have an impact on the national debate if we say, if this university says, we've had enough. As RB said, Hurricane Sandy hit us, Irene hit us before that. We are fed up in this state. We've gotten trashed by 2 hurricanes, unleashed in large part by the burning of fossil fuels, and we are not going to take it. Thank you very much.
Here, here, here. I thank the speaker for his remarks, and now call the honorable member of the opposition, Sean Leonard, to continue the case for side opposition.
You know, it's not every day I get to stand on the same stage as 2 Rutgers professors on equal ground, and while it's kind of intimidating, it's a really cool experience to be through. But today, I stand on the right side of this debate, and I stand on the actual idea of having the right method of dealing with the problem. And the problem with government's side, and the fundamental philosophical difficulty that they're not getting from our side, is that they're not actually affecting the actual energy companies and the climate change as a whole in a beneficial way. And we're going to show you on our side of the house that their side is actually actively hurting alternative energy on the whole. But first off, let's deal with a few of the responses to our points. Quinn comes up here and tells you that a lot of companies are icky. And understandably, they agree with us, because defending Walmart's a really hard thing to do. But basically, they say that, like, this is going to be, they accept this idea, and that they're going to try and change the companies, and that Rutgers shouldn't be supporting these companies on the individual level. But the problem, and something that they don't really deal with on their side of the house, and a lot of our points, was dealing with the fact that a lot of these companies are actually doing good things for the environment and actually moving towards alternative energy. We give you a lot of examples, and I'm going to deal with one of them that was in PMC. Arby comes up here and talks about ExxonMobil, and in the same speech says that solar energy is a great thing. Here's a really big problem with their side of the case. ExxonMobil is one of the biggest companies that deal with solar power infrastructure on college campuses throughout the nation. Insofar as this is the case, we're actually going to be hurting one of the companies that is dealing with these alternative energies, that is giving solar power the ability to exist on college campuses in a way that is actually beneficial instead of divestment, which won't actually tangibly change how these companies operate. Sure.
First of all, ExxonMobil invests in algae. But the actual question is, like, understanding this, which would be better to invest in? An investment which would send 100% of your investment into solar, such as like investing in a purely solar company, or investing in a mixed energy company, which would send 5% of your investment into alternative energies.
The problem with this question is that it assumes we can invest in a solar power company with complete benefits and with the investment actually being returned. The problem with solar power companies right now is that a lot of them aren't profitable, a lot of them aren't run well, and a lot of them are just not tangibly good investments for the Rutgers University on a whole. What we give you is the ability to invest in energy companies that can give you alternative energy, that can actually benefit the nation and benefit our climate change in a way that actually helps change it over the long term, while still giving students benefits. Something that they really don't deal with on their side of the house is this fact that they're going to be hurting Rutgers students on the whole by taking away these investments. That when you take away these very profitable things, and when you neglect to actually put money into mutual funds, into the S&P index, then what you're doing is you're taking away from the total amount of money that Rutgers has. You're taking away from the money that goes towards financial aid, that goes towards dormitories, that goes towards having better buildings, better teachers, more curriculums, more education. Insofar as that is the case, we're giving you a balanced ground. We're giving you a world where you can have the best of both things, where companies can actually give money to alternative energy, like ExxonMobil putting in algae fuels, like Chevron doing things for solar energy, like BP doing things for startup companies. The big thing about BP is they have their own little thing, they have their own little branch that invests in startup alternative energy companies. These are companies that we're going to be divesting from that are tangibly affecting the alternative energy climate. On our side of the house, we give you the best of both worlds. I think that's the best part of this debate. Second point that they that we give up is that the efficacy of divestment and the efficiency of it itself is completely wrong. And their response to this is it's more of a symbolic victory, that it's sending a message to Congress and it's sending a message to the world that we're not going to deal with this anymore. I don't think this symbolic message actually stands or holds any water when you understand that a lot of these companies are putting money into alternative energy. A lot of them do recognize that there is an economic incentive to move away from fossil fuels in the long term, but not in the short term. Insofar as that is the case, we're in a situation it's fun, isn't it? We're in a situation where you actually have where you actually are able to have best of both worlds. But the symbolic victory on their side of the house is fundamentally undermined by what they're not doing. Imagine this. A student movement is on the steps of Brouwer. They cheer. They've been able to effectively divest from all of these scenarios. They've been able to take all of Rutgers stocks out of these companies. They then board the buses that are fueled by fossil fuels, and then go back to their apartments and dormitories, which are heated and have electricity from coal and other fossil fuels. I don't think this is going to be a very symbolic victory. I think this makes us look more like hypocrites if anything else. It makes us look bad. It makes us look like a bunch of people that are galvanized by a political opinion and not actually looking at the whole issue itself. Because insofar as we're still using fossil fuels and we're still doing all of these things in the status quo, then this sort of symbolic victory doesn't hold any water. Because the fundamental problem with dealing with economic incentives is that these companies don't exist because they're evil conglomerates that just want to ruin the world. They're companies that are giving a service to people. We're basically going up there and saying, yes, we still give you our money for this, but we don't agree with what you're doing. It's a fundamental philosophical problem on their side of the house that they don't deal with, and it undermines any efficacy of a symbolic victory, and it undermines anything that they could potentially get from this sort of movement. Third point we bring you is the fact that divestment just doesn't work. We've seen it happen all of the time. We see it dealt with. We see other divestment movements like landmines, divest from Israel, and they just don't work. And the professor goes up here and gives us the response of, yeah, but give it some time. But the reality of the situation is, without the symbolic victory, divestment will never work, and I think I've substantiated to you as to why divestment won't work. But the reality is, we've been dealing with divestment movements for decades. We've been dealing with them for a very substantial amount of time. And while Quinn may be a young man, he's not actually going to probably see any divestment movements be particularly successful. And we've also seen these movements be tried for 6 years and have almost no efficacy whatsoever. We don't think this is the right way to go about the problems. We think that companies should actually internalize the costs. And if we can make them do that, then we have far more public opinion, and we actually have the best of both worlds, something that they cannot promise you. In fact, they hurt both worlds. Our case, moving to the off case, their points basically, they say that there's a moral obligation to do this. Quinn basically says there isn't a moral obligation. For one, you have an obligation to your students above all. Rutgers University is dedicated to us, the students, and their endowment themselves. So insofar as we can show you that you're actually tangibly hurting students in this scenario, then it's a very problematic scenario, or situation. Sure.
Sean, if it's true what Quinn claimed, only 4% of our endowment is in all these fossil fuel companies, how is it going to hurt us significantly if we divest from those funds?
First off, because this actually makes a lot of money. The point that we basically bring you is that it doesn't hurt the companies themselves. But since Rutgers is making a lot of money from these mutual funds, then we're going to actually have less money on the whole. And while maybe it's not going to be like a $100 million loss or a giant sum of money, even if it's only $10 million, that's still somebody who's not going to have financial aid enough to go to the institution. That's still somebody who's not going to be accepted. So while it might not be a huge cost, we think it is actually a very personal and emotional cost to these individuals, because it will actually be somebody who's not going to the university, when on our side of the house, they can go to the university. So basically, they talk about moral obligation. We tell you that you have Rutgers obligation. They say that Rutgers can be a leader in this circumstance. Symbolic victories won't work on their side of the house. They say that long-term investments in alternative energy is what you're going to actually try and do. But on our side of the house, we give you companies that are making long-term investments. So if they like long-term investments, I think they should invest in, I don't know, Chevron or something. I heard they're pretty good with solar panels. So insofar as that is the case, I'm proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for his remarks, and now I'd like to call the Honorable Opposition Whip, Professor Bruce Misrak, to close the case for side opposition.
You're here.
Good evening, everyone. I rise in opposition to this resolution, and I'm going to follow the structure that the previous debaters have brought to this point, which is to, I guess, break the arguments into three parts. I would say there are arguments that are economic, and I hope I speak with some authority on that, given my research in the area. I'll also talk a bit about efficacy, where I think, again, there's some history and research on the economic side that might help inform that discussion. And then I'll close with my weakest strength, moral arguments, but I'll try to convince you that economic arguments are also moral arguments in the end. So let me first start and say that I guess the part of the government's resolution that I find most interesting, or arguments for the resolution most interesting, is they seem to feel that they have the ability to predict stock prices. I've heard the other side tell us many, many times that they know that fossil fuels are going into decline, that these companies are bad investments, and let's get out in front of it. In fact, why don't we go ahead and short the stocks, which we certainly can do. We could sell the stocks now, hoping to profit from their lower prices later. History suggests that no one's particularly good at doing this, including those pension fund managers at Rutgers or in the state of New Jersey, or even the slightly more sophisticated hedge fund managers out there. The market seems to be pretty good at allocating capital, and somehow I don't think that the government has any particular advantage in taking over that function for us. The second part, I think, where the government's proposition is actually quite weak is that it doesn't carefully distinguish between producers and consumers of carbon emissions or fossil fuels. So the resolution is obviously targeted towards, let's just take as the main component, ExxonMobil, who is a producer of fossil fuels. But if you've studied movements to try to limit things that people think are harmful, it also makes sense to, in fact, be working on the consumer side. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that working on the consumer side is the better way. I was going to take a little poll. Raise your hand if you brought a bottled water to tonight's debate. Is it in fact being served here? Okay. Well, I want to divest in you then. Okay. You should not, if you want to, and I'll come back to this in my moral discussions. Perhaps if Rutgers wanted to take a leadership position on carbon emissions, we might ban the sale of water on campus in bottled form. Okay. Well, I hear claps, but what I don't want to hear claps is I just simply want to see the proper pricing structure. People should be free to make choices, and I'll come back to this in my moral arguments, and prices are, in fact, a way to influence people's moral choices, and that's ultimately where economists side in this debate. The third thing, and I guess this is where I think my research informs tonight's discussion, is that I've been doing research for the last 5 years or so now. This is a short speech? How much time do I thought I had it. I thought I had the same as the others. Okay. Is that all right? Okay. So if you give me 5, probably another 2 minutes I can do it. So the third point is that I would say that folks have tried to limit emissions of various different kinds. Way back in the bright days of the Republican Party, in the George Bush the first administration, we actually proposed a cap-and-trade program on, in this case, SOx, on sulfur dioxide. And this was a remarkably effective program, which in fact improved the environment throughout the Northeast. This was then followed in Europe. The United States lost moral and economic leadership on this particular issue with the EU ETS, the emissions trading scheme, which has been taxing carbon emissions through a cap-and-trade program in Europe. We have a program here in the Northeast, which was mentioned in the first rebuttal, regarding the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which taxes utility emissions, again, through a cap-and-trade scheme. And then finally, we also have a program passed by Governor Schwarzenegger in California, the California Cap-and-Trade Scheme as well. So there are, in fact, exactly the scalpels that the opposition has been talking about that target not the entire activities of a particular company, do not target one particular type of economic activity over another, but in fact strike directly at the things that are harmful to the environment, in this case the pollution produced by the fossil fuels. So why not, in fact, put Rutgers, in, again, moral vision, if you like, behind this particular movement to, in fact, tax and internalize the externality that's coming from carbon pollution. So second, I would move to the question of efficacy, and I'll try to be brief here since I guess I've taken more than my allotted time. So as it comes to efficacy, there is this issue as to whether or not you want to be an insider or outsider regarding particular activities of corporations. And certainly there are arguments on both sides. Since I'm with the opposition, I'll say that it probably makes more sense for Rutgers to attend the meetings of ExxonMobil and try to encourage their activities to move in the direction that we are desirable, rather than to be shouting outside with a bullhorn. The second then is that there could actually be costs to students and members of the Rutgers University community through this divestment movement. And there are a bunch of practical reasons that make this very difficult. Unfortunately, most universities and investors, in fact, now invest in what are known as index funds, and trying then to form an index fund that's net of these fossil fuel producers is, in fact, quite difficult. Of course, going back to my earlier argument, I also want to say then, let's make sure that Perrier is also divested from the portfolio before we conclude the evening. So I very much doubt the efficacy of our efforts to try to divest the university of ownership positions in these companies, and instead say that we might be better trying to use our votes, and that's in fact exactly what shares are, votes to try to influence the direction of these companies. I don't actually tend to think that those are very effective myself. I was told that I didn't have to respond, but I love the gesture, so go ahead.
Since you know about shareholder resolution, has there ever been a successful shareholder resolution that has asked a company to give up 80% of its assets? Because 80% is the portion of proven reserves which would have to stay in the ground in order to stabilize the climate. Do you think we could honestly promote a shareholder resolution that would work at a company like ExxonMobil?
If I wasn't on the opposition team, I would tell you that shareholder resolutions are a joke. What I believe are I would tell you that prices work. Okay, and this is where I turn to the conclusion of my arguments, which are I want to push the moral argument in the direction of prices, and you might think this comes from my 25-year career as an economist, and I think about things other than prices, believe me. In any event, if you want moral leadership on this particular question, as I said, we could begin by starting to ban things or price things with a tax that are indeed also harmful to the environment. These include the bottled water, which everyone's familiar with. Well, how about, for instance, not selling Chilean grapes during the winter time? So there are movements afoot, and this has started to gain some currency in Europe, to simply put a carbon footprint on every consumer product that you take out of the store. Let's know, in fact, what the actual costs are, and let's, in fact, tax it on the basis, then, of that carbon footprint. Again, much more highly effective than would be. And so what I would say is that the environmental movement, and this is where I speak not for any particular team, the environmental movement has been held back by emphasis on moral virtue. Are you a greener citizen if you rode your bike to tonight's debate rather than took an Escalade? And don't worry, I didn't take the Escalade. But nonetheless, are you a more morally virtuous person if you did one activity versus the other? We tend to think that the person riding the bike somehow deserves our praise. And I say, make your choices. Ride your bike. Take your Escalade. The important point is the guy riding the Escalade needs to pay a lot of taxes for the externalities and negative carbon pollution, and probably also an extra little added bonus to the Defense Department budget for riding that big gas guzzler here tonight. Let him make his choices, but make sure that he pays to clean up for his mess.
I thank the Speaker for his summation, and finally call the Honorable Government Whip, Barnaby Sriram, to close the case for government and the rest.
You're here. Okay, sorry, it's okay. I could have adapted, but not in speech.
Very, very happy to be here. I'm going to give you 3 questions that you should consider when you decide which side won the round. And I think it's very clear that side gov is the right side in this debate. The first question I'm going to ask you is this movement necessary? So if anyone has been reading the news lately, you know that the air in China defies physics. It's just, they're breathing in asphalt right now. And there was an entrepreneur, and no joke, he's selling canned air so people can actually buy off of this, making a lot of profit, right? So clearly there's a need for decarbonization. Hybrids are becoming very popular in the United States. And get this, even China, in their latest climate policy booklet, actually mentioned that they're going to put a significant amount of effort into cleaning up their air and trying to find renewable forms of energy. And we think at this juncture, lawmakers need the final push to make sure that oil companies keep the carbon under the ground, because there's literally no other way in which we can actually save the environment, right? And why is this the case? Because ExxonMobil is not stupid. They're not going to be like, hey, we're really bad. Maybe we should take a cut out of our bonus and not make it, generate any more fossil fuel. That's never going to happen. We don't care about what they are going to do, right? SideGov believes that we should try and put pressure on the government of countries to actually effect some sort of change. That's the only way in which it can happen. And political change will not happen when American money is invested in Exxon. If politicians are to believe that a lot of our universities, that a lot of our people will, lose heavily if Exxon goes under, they're never going to make policies against these companies. They're never going to try and, put more investment into green energy. Only at the point where Americans' future does not depend on the oil companies will the politicians be moved to affect any sort of change at all. And we say that we should be the leader in affecting this sort of pressure on the government, right? Maybe Rutgers will be the early ones to do it. We think other universities definitely will do it, because I'll talk to you later about why investing in oil is not a good idea to begin with at all, right? But we think that at the point where political change cannot happen if we don't put pressure on the government, we ought to do this, especially since, as Quinn says, it's only 4% of our portfolio. I think we can all adjust with maybe $2 million less. Maybe we won't put that money in the football stadium and use that to divert it to scholarships. There's always something we can do, because it's not just it's not harming somebody else. It's like our own lives that's going to be harmed. And we think that's a very small price to pay in the short term to ensure that our futures are not, breathing in asphalt in the long term. We think it's a worthy price to pay. The second thing I want to tell you about is social responsibility, and we think we are winning that definitely, right? We tell you, so Rutgers has the largest solar panel field of any university in the nation, in the whole entire nation. I think we're taking a strong stance here that decarbonization is good, and we still have more plans to have, renewable forms of energy, right? And at this point, it is sort of philosophically inconsistent to be like, oh, we won't consume solar energy, but fingers crossed, we hope they do well so our endowment grows bigger. We think it's very philosophically inconsistent, right? And we think SideOp actually mentioned many arguments like, hey, why don't we ban the bottles? Why don't we stop buying Chilean grapes? We're perfectly okay with those things. I actually carry my own bottle and fill water in that, right? We're okay with having those sorts of policies as well, but we think divesting is extremely important. We don't think that it's okay to, have our futures depend on something that is causing us a lot of harm. By the way, if every time there's a hit in the public sector, every time money has to be put into FEMA to clean up the disaster from Hurricane Sandy, Rutgers' budget gets cut. So by investing in these companies, by causing climate change, by actually having a hand in that, we are actually losing money. So I don't think they have a good point where they say that, hey, Rutgers needs the money from the endowment, because these are the very companies that are causing our losses at the end of the day. And they also talk about this argument that, hey, you know what? Somebody is going to invest in these companies. If not us, some greedy hedge fund manager is going to, benefit from this. Why don't we make use of it? This is a really bad argument, right? Like maybe somebody out there is investing and is benefiting from a company that uses child labor in China and they get a lot of money out of it. Should we also join in there because they get money? No, at some point we think as a university we should consider the social impact that we have. And clearly here, the argument is that maybe our lives matter more than like a couple of dollars in the short term. And in the long term, we won't even have those dollars because according to them, Exxon loves wind turbines, right? Exxon loves algae fuel cells. So at the point where it's clear that green energy is where the future lies, we should move towards that now. We should lead in the lead the movement instead of follow in when there's no other choice. We think that puts us in a very, very bad position. The last thing I want to talk to you about is this a good move investment-wise? And this is basically what it comes down to. I think everybody does care about the numbers, and I think we are still winning that on our side of the house, right? At the point where everybody is moving towards green energy, and including China and all the other BRIC countries, we don't think there'll be such a huge demand for fossil fuels in the future, right? At that point, fuel companies aren't going to do very well. And at that point, we don't actually get a very good return on our investment. If their share prices go down now, we think that it's more likely that somebody will acquire them, the governments can actually acquire them, and maybe stem their activities. But there's literally no other way that we can actually get a good return on our investments. If their value is high now, if we sell it now, then we get a profit. We can invest it in something in its primacy. Hell, invest in Chipotle, I don't care. Some other sector that actually earns a lot of returns, because there are plenty of other sectors that do earn money. We think that we shouldn't have a hand in this, right? And they also talk about, and we also have to understand that oil companies' prices are very, very volatile. Think of all the strife that is going on in the Middle East. Think of all the environmental damage it's causing. We don't think it's a good investment. Like a lot of people who had invested in oil companies took a big hit when there was a lot of when there was strife in Egypt and Tunisia, and now the Iraq war, problems in Iraq and Iran and all those places. So we don't think it's a very stable sort of investment either. They're not winning on the social front. They're not winning on the economic front. We think they maybe have some benefits in the short term, but they're doing it at the cost of our lives in long term, and we just don't think it's worth it. We're very, very proud to propose.
Here, here. Thank the speaker, and invite both sides to cross the floor and shake hands. To invite people to line up if they so choose and ask some questions of our fine panelists on both sides, and or make a brief comment if you want to oppose something that was said. And please just say who you're directing it to, be it an individual or be it a particular team. So if you want to come forward and line up, that would be great.
Since no one's coming up, and by the way, I'm going to speak a lot slower than the people on this debate. I've never been to a debate, and you speak awfully quickly. In fact, I was very impressed by the two professors that seem to keep up with people that do this all the time. But I would make a couple of points and then ask a question of the economics professor, regardless of the side that he is on. The first point that I would make that is a comment about real estate. And the comment about real estate, if you know the saying is, what's important about real estate? It's location, location, location. If you know what's important about global warming, you know that it's national climate legislation. National climate legislation. National climate legislation. The second speaker made this point. He said that in order to correctly deal with the problem of global warming, we need carbon legislation. And I would like the economics professor to explain that to everyone.
I'll do my best. I think anyone on this panel could probably, on either side, could tell you that we need carbon legislation. So the opposition side is not opposed to carbon legislation. They question, as I do, the efficacy of divestment as a tool of achieving carbon reduction. So we're not climate deniers on this side. I paid a heck of a lot of money to remove the trees from my backyard, and I want there to be a Jersey Shore for my children and so on. So there's no issue here in terms of the negative effects of global warming, global climate change. It's just a question of how most effectively to do it. And so we have these complicated enterprises known as corporations, and it's easy to perhaps vilify ExxonMobil. In my day, it would have been for what they did in Alaska, and nowadays it might be for the fossil fuels that they're producing. But the fact of the matter is that there are parts of those companies that are actually doing good things, and parts of those companies that we might think are doing harmful things to the environment. And so why then would you hit the capital base of the entire corporation when in fact what you want to do is you want to favor the part of the company that's doing beneficial things and decrease activity in the part that's doing harmful things? And you're right, carbon legislation is the way to do that. What I would say is that we have movements in the United States, Europe, and also Australia and New Zealand to try to precisely do this, to tax carbon, whether it's directly or in the form of cap and trade legislation. The only thing that you should be concerned about, even though I go around and argue for these things all the time, is that the largest producer of carbon in the world is China, and is not subject to any of these rules or regulations or taxation of any form. And then the problem is, as you know, is that carbon is a global pollutant. one ton of CO2 equivalent coming from China is this just as good or just as harmful to the environment as 1 ton of CO2 equivalent coming from my backyard. And so we have this difficulty then of not only having national carbon legislation, but having international carbon legislation, and that's a problem that's above my pay grade.
Can I jump in and respond to that question a little bit? Is that the format allowed? I think, to clarify our position slightly, well, the way Bill McKibben explains the divestment movement, it's not about bankrupting the oil companies. And it's not about preventing them from producing oil, at least not immediately. It's about addressing one particular activity they do, which is buying the U.S. government. And the good stuff they're doing is all to kind of drop in the bucket of corporate greenwashing. And so you can get national climate legislation, and you can get a carbon price, and you can get carbon taxes if you remove the opposition, the well-financed opposition to those very sensible measures. And the oil companies are a huge part of that opposition. So all of these great ideas, that both sides have thrown out a lot of brilliant ideas of how to address the problem of carbon emissions, and I think they're all consonant with each other. And you just have to look at what your leverage as an institution. What can you do as an institution that has an impact moving towards national legislation?
Professor Hughes actually addressed this question already, but my question was for the opposition, specifically wondering all these proposals, all these legislative proposals, how you expected them to be done in the climate where oil companies finance opposition to every proposal like this, and the fact that divestment is really aimed at decreasing their political influence, and that they will never do this by themselves. And isn't it a bit naive to think that without hurting them in some way, you can just get them to lay off the Congress?
So I think our position in this debate round is not that immediately we'll get massive carbon taxes passed and every externality will be internalized. What we were trying to point out more is that empirically in society right now, there is a large amount of political will for things like carbon taxes. See, for example, 10 northeastern states, I don't know which ones off the top of my head, do actually tax the carbon out on utilities. And it's just like a slight implementation thing that means that it doesn't get that much publicity or hasn't been that effective. But realistically, I do think in the long term, combined with the fact that these companies have long-term incentives to shift towards green technology, you can get people who are willing to slowly change the culture and slowly say we're going to tax oil companies more.
I'm all for going green, all for divesting from these oil companies and this and that. But if we take all their money away, if everybody divests from them, who's going to have the money to invest in the green technologies? Who's going to have the money to pay for the development of these new, the hydrogen fuel cells or some unheard of technologies that we don't have today?
So the cool part about this is that a majority of new green technologies and fuel cells either come from smaller companies trying to make headway into this, or they come from research institutions like Rutgers, which actually try to develop this new technology. It's not a question of how we develop this new technology, because Exxon isn't magically hiding in their lab somewhere trying to make a better solar fuel cell.
How do you know this? How do you know that they're not developing some technologies that we don't know of?
Because their financials are literally $600 billion, I think, over a few years, a large span, or 600 million or something like that, going into algae, bioalgae and stuff like that, which isn't really the direction that is actually best, and also isn't most efficient, because we see that there are enormous reductions in costs for wind, costs for solar, and costs for hydro. Recently, I think it was a week ago, a company in New Mexico announced that it was charging 5.8 cents per kilowatt This might be like weird for like 5.8 cents per kilowatt. What does that mean? Because it was solar, but like the average like cost of solar is usually 14 cents per kilowatt, and coal sells for 8 cents per kilowatt. So you see that like these companies, which aren't Exxon, it's like this company called First Solar, are making major strides to actually undercut like the average prices of things like coal or natural gas.
But these algae companies, they are truly green companies. They're trying to make energy from plant matter. This algae, it collects the sunlight and produces energy.
That's fair, but like the problem is that they're investing only 5% of their total expenditures into this. It's like
What's 5% of Exxon's total?
$8 billion.
$8 billion.
Yeah,
$8 billion going into green technology.
yeah. But like that $8 billion is literally going into mostly algae. 0.5?
No, you're talking about a much smaller, tiny percent.
Maybe 2 billion. I don't know. Going into entirely greenhouse.
But in the
So
Okay, so what I wanted to add is that Exxon doesn't really have an incentive to like push fuel cells and wind turbines into people's hands, because every fuel cell bought, every wind turbine bought is cutting into their bottom line. That's somebody buying less fuel. So they really have no incentive. They're going green. It's maybe to spruce up their public image a little bit, but it's not clear that they're doing something long term to actually provide people with green energy that can be bought and used in their households, because it just doesn't make any economic sense for them to do so.
Yes, it does. It makes perfect sense. Because right now, oil is a stepping stone. Oil is a stepping stone to the next level of technology, to the next level of energy.
Well, we can, I think, agree to disagree on that.
Hi, thanks for the debate. Just had a few questions. The first was directed towards the opposition. Has anyone tried taxing? Someone might have already answered this, but has there been already like another few other countries that have tried taxing forms of CO2 emission? And what were the gains, both long-term and short-term? And I guess the second question, which is directed towards all of you in general, is that what would taxing emission of CO2 would it benefit? What would it benefit more, the environment or ultimately government?
So first, to deal with the question directed towards the opposition. So fairly recently, I think it was like in 2006 or so, the 10 northeastern states passed like carbon taxes on utilities. Right now, there haven't been that much gains. Is it 11? Okay, it's 11 states. I guess there's. Oh. It's 9 states now. Okay. Okay. You know way better than I do.
But are you currently in government?
I left government.
Okay, good.
But what I think you should know is you asked if there were benefits. So there were 10 states, and the benefits were that the monies that were taken in were reinvested in renewable energy and energy efficiency programs. So New Jersey was taking in $65 million a year. So I think that's one answer to your question. New Jersey no longer participates in that program, but the other states do. The other thing I think would be useful for you to talk about might be a little bit, you could talk about renewable portfolio standards. All right.
No, it's
well,
not
because you asked about what are some of the incentives for companies to participate or to do things like renewables. And New Jersey does have a renewable portfolio standard, and many states do. And it's actually a piece of legislation that says you must meet a certain percentage of your energy coming from renewable energies, and it's to create a market. Okay, so I just thought I'd make some points of clarification.
And to give the state a little bit of credit, New Jersey is the #2 producer of solar power in the United States, and that's not because of our sunny that's not because of our sunny climate. Okay.
It's per capita, though. California's bigger. It's per capita. New Jersey's
I said second overall and first per capita. So right, we're not in disagreement.
I would like to ask if it might be more efficient to talk states into signing on to California's cap and trade system.
Well, I don't
don't know who that was directed to. Let's get back to the point of what what leverage an institution has. I don't think it's a question of being more efficient. I would try that. I would try that, absolutely. I would try going to Christie and doing that. And I'm sure there are people at this university already doing that. But the university, as a student movement at this university, has a number of points of leverage. And one of the things it can do is try to dissociate the university from corporations that are driving the problem. And I don't think any of these solutions are mutually incompatible. I just think given historical precedent, because of the South African case, I think you could anticipate this movement, especially if Rutgers jumpstarts it among major universities, you could anticipate it being effective. But I wouldn't say to somebody who's working 100 hours a week right now trying to do that, oh, drop that and come join us. No, I would say to people who aren't working on this at all, come join us. And in fact, I forgot that announcement. There is a demonstration in Washington on February 17th, which is a week from Sunday, and there's a sign-up sheet going around. That demonstration is opposing the the XL Keystone pipeline, which would bring a whole lot of hydrocarbons into production and really very much negatively affect
Point
these
of
issues.
information.
Go ahead.
There's a flyer that gives you information about how you can sign up for a bus to go down to the demonstration, and there's a sign-up sheet if you'd like more information about Rutgers' divestment campaign.
Thank you very much for this very enlightening debate. I happen to have been involved very actively in the anti-apartheid movement as a faculty leader here and also one of the members of the state New Jersey Anti-Apartheid Coalition. And I think New Jersey gained a great deal of credit and Rutgers gained a great deal of credit by taking the leadership in that action. There are a couple of very close parallels between the South African anti-apartheid campaign and the divestment campaign here at Rutgers and the current call for divestment. And I'd like to just point out a couple of those parallels, but ask questions at the same time of the panel. I think one of the questions that has to be faced by those who advocate for divestment is where does the leadership come from? And the answer, if you look at the anti-apartheid campaign and the divestment campaign at Rutgers, it came from the students. The students must lead. And they also, though, have to have allies within the state of New Jersey, and you have to identify those allies and find them and work with them. In that case, the allies were the religious community, which I think would probably be allies in this case, and particularly in that case, the black leadership of the various Christian movements, and the labor unions, and that's a tough one that has to be faced up to. But I think they'll come along too, because they have the long-term interests. Second question, really, and I'd like you to address that. Second question, how do you build awareness, either for your position or for the pro position? I think these symbolic actions are very, very important. In that particular case, in the Rutgers divestment, J&J was the way in which the symbolic issues were raised. People demonstrated at J&J month after month, year after year. J&J never divested. But that didn't matter because you got very good publicity. You got newspaper articles all the time. And what is this about? It really is power, as several people have pointed out. I think this team has not addressed that. This is about power. This is about building a movement, and the divestment campaign seems to do that. Third, what about the administration and the responsibility of Rutgers as a whole? Well, the lesson from the anti-apartheid campaign here, the divestment campaign here, was go directly to the president. And we went directly to President Blaustein time after time after time. And to his great credit, he eventually became a leader and said we must divest. And I think you have to answer that. Why wouldn't the president here, who is a scientist, who knows the facts in this case, who knows everything about the weight of the different arguments, why won't he come along if he is asked in the right way and maybe repeatedly? And then what about this question of the cost to the university? The divestment campaign at that point against South Africa really showed that Rutgers has very astute investment officers, and they know how to divest from companies and reinvest in other companies in ways that will not hurt any student, any parent who is paying for their students. Portfolio standards, a lot of that goes back to this campaign. Right? And there's many things to really learn from this. Above all, it's power. And you have to build a movement that will force these companies to change, not marginally, not reform, but something that has a popular base. Thank you.
Okay, who wants to take
first? Okay, well, let me just say, that was Al Howard, Emeritus Professor of History and African Studies.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think there were like 4 major things in there. There was, what's the role of the administration? Where does the leadership come from? How do we build awareness? And what happens once we build a movement? So what I'm personally going to address is building a movement. So I don't think that anyone on opposition benches today said that if the entirety of the university community of the United States were to divest from fossil fuels, that would have like no impact whatsoever. What we were more saying is that while we can look nicely at like the anti-apartheid campaign and say it was a very successful divestment, I was able to find 4 other examples of divestment, and I don't know how many other hundreds there are that just never got off the ground that people tried to get through. And I think that divestment just generally isn't a very effective strategy. That's why, I think that's the main reason why we would oppose this resolution, simply saying that we doubt that a movement would get built on this specific issue, especially with how long it's been taking for it to even get off the ground and how much opposition it has faced in lots of high-level university communities.
You did it so long that it's been going, it's only been since this past November that this campaign was introduced. And you keep saying that it's several years.
So
it's only been introduced in December or in November by Bill McKibben.
So 350.org, which is the organization I thought we were concerned with, has existed since 2007 and has been at
2007 was Step It Up.
Oh yeah, no 2000.
That's right.
Yeah. 2007, yeah.
But I think it is fair to say that the college campus divestment strategy of 350.org is 6 months old, and there are 250 campuses that say they're on board.
Yeah.
Only 3 of, so anyway, just
Okay, so if we
early days.
if we look at those 3 campuses, I only know specific things about one of those, Sterling College, which actually divested yesterday. Cool, interestingly enough, is a small liberal arts institution with an endowment of less than $1 million that specifically focuses on environmental issues. I don't think the fact that we've gotten like 3 small colleges that most people in this room probably at least haven't heard of shows that a movement is really forming, and I just don't. That's like one of the main reasons why we think this won't work.
They added 250 some colleges to the campaign since November, and you make it sound like it's been going on for years and it's not getting anywhere.
So the 200.
Wait.
Okay.
I think Quinn is very adamant about the position he's being made to argue. Sometimes when you debate, you keep arguing your position because you want some form of internal victory.
I mean, I have to defend this position. I'm giving the arguments this side would give, not necessarily what I personally believe.
Very true.
I'm not asking whether you believe it, I'm asking whether those are facts that are used.
Okay. Anyway, so
it's not facts that the divestiture campaign is years old. It's only been introduced by 350 in November of last year.
Yeah. Okay, so I think it's interesting that we say that there are 253 colleges, but like, for example, if we look at the response of most endowment funds, even with overwhelming public support, it's not like the endowment funds were like, let's come to a reasonable compromise, let's talk about trying to slow down. The endowments fund just literally sent a response of no and didn't even give any reasons behind it. So I think that does show that the administrations and the endowment funds will still be very stubborn. Even though there are movements on 250 college campuses, I'm not denying that. All I'm saying is I don't think these movements are going to lead to actual results.
On the counter side of that, this election year has been very contested because of climate change. It is a national issue on the forefront of everyone's minds. We are having like multiple international meetings based on this, and people are realizing and internalizing the costs, especially in a place like New Jersey. This makes it very easy to start a movement on a campus like ours with student momentum because, honestly, personally, I could barely pay for college this year. My house was flooded, not in Sandy, there was storm damage in Sandy, but it was flooded in Irene, and my parents had to pay thousands of dollars in order to repair it, personally, because they didn't have flood insurance. It wasn't considered a flood zone. So when you're internalizing the costs of this, it's not just student aid, oh, we have a little bit less of. It's some students don't have homes anymore, and maybe that's a priority over college for certain people. These people, including me to a certain extent, are very passionate about these changes. If push towards it, if meetings are organized, if people rally together, if the president of Rutgers is petitioned, and the evidence is brought forth in an objective manner which details what the costs truly are, I think there is an incredibly compelling argument for Rutgers especially. We are a public institution, an institution which has, will probably lose a lot in the future because of the damages that New Jersey has accrued, whose students have lost massive amounts because of things peripherally affected by climate change. And at the end of the day, that's what's going to drive us forward to change, the personal impacts that this has had on us.
I also want to add something. I think there's a huge problem with the attitude of, I don't know, Harvard didn't do it, only 3 colleges did it. And I think it's time we step up and be a leader. Rutgers is big enough, and if the arguments for divesting make sense, I think we should take the first step. I don't see why there's a reason to be the last person to join when we have no other choice, because that puts us in a very bad position. If it makes sense right now, we should do it. There have been plenty of times where much smarter people have made very, very bad choices. So if we see that there's a choice and it's the right one, that we should make it when we can.
Also, I swear to you guys, Rutgers will be better than Harvard by the end of this semester in debate. So our logic is much more sound.
I mean, in general, from what I understand, no one is really supporting Exxon from either side, which has, some credit, obviously. However, I mean, obviously negative feedback is not as effective in general as positive feedback. So this might be slightly counterintuitive, and although Exxon obviously doesn't care if they're liked or not, I was wondering potentially, instead of, again, taking away any support from Exxon, which does invest a lot in alternative energy, why don't we actually almost become, I won't say support them, but I mean almost have, I want to say pro renewable rally kind of thing, but actually support Exxon and have them actually appear to be, the pro renewable energy sponsors that they are. And I mean, that would also put pressure on Exxon actually keep being, I know I'm saying a lot, that's kind of annoying, they'll put pressure on them so that they maintain their renewable energy standard. Oh, that was really a question.
The only way you can meaningfully affect these companies is if you actually hurt their basic profit margin. Even Exxon's renewables, as we were addressing earlier, are algae-based. The reason it's especially interested in algae renewables is because you have to keep buying. If you create a good enough solar panel that actually gives you enough photovoltaic conductivity to be planted on a house and permanently provide that house with fuel or that car with energy, then Exxon is out of business because you can't keep selling those. That's not a form of fuel, that's just a self-sustaining car. The problem with that, and the reason they're trying to invest on things like algae, is because they can keep selling you stuff like that, as opposed to consistent, as opposed to one-time purchase products in the long term.
Actually, to respond to this is something in debate called responding to the example instead of the argument. There's tons of big energy companies that are investing in good things, like Chevron, biggest solar panel. BP has specific things dealt with energy startup companies. So I understand the merit of your argument. Take these companies and give them some sort of economic benefit to having these alternative energy things, because there is such a thing as like shareholder resolutions. And even if in status quo they're kind of a joke, as the professor says, there are measures that we can take to pressure companies from within. And I think it's far more effective and far more pertinent to companies when their stockholders themselves are revolting or saying that this is the thing that they have to do, as opposed to public opinion that doesn't give them any economic incentive. Sure.
Let me address that. Wait, hold. It said.
Changing the corporate behaviors to have national climate legislation. All the rest of it is frills around the edges. It's not going to affect anything. Ask the professor right next.
Hold on. I'm responding to the first question.
We have another
the thing that I study in my economic work as my anthropological work academically is culture within oil companies. No one is large as ExxonMobil, but the National Oil Company of Trinidad and Tobago, and I've looked a little bit at British Gas and BP in Trinidad and Tobago, and these companies are in a difficult position. And I think, well, I'll tell you what the difficulty is, but the extent to which they're investing in solar, BP did that for a while and called themselves Beyond Petroleum. Partly it's in order to present themselves as supporting renewables and supporting a diverse energy portfolio, so they invest a tiny bit. Partly it's actually to slow down the development of those industries so that they can compete against startups that are actually trying to do something. And they can quickly, as BP did, jettison those investments and shut the whole program down. But the real problem for oil companies is that oil is not just about profits. It's about assets. Because oil companies own oil in the ground, right? It's like, it's like you own, if you're a company that makes tractors or bulldozers, and you own, 500 million tons of steel, right? And you got to make something with that steel. You got to do something with it. If you don't do something, if the oil companies don't do something with their oil, then they've got nothing to do, and they cannot write off those assets and remain viable, right? That's why this is an existential crisis for every oil company and every coal company and every gas company, right? And so there's no way that those companies can go green, right? They can do frills on the side. So what we have to do, I think, is we have to destroy those companies. And we're not going to do it directly. The government is going to do it for us, and we're going to pressure the government to do it. And it's going to be really tough. It's going to be tougher on them, I think, than it is on us. But it's going to be tough on everybody if they continue with their business model, because their business model changes the conditions for life on the planet in a way that's bad for our education and a lot of other things.
So I just want to thank everyone, especially everyone who stayed till the end to contribute their questions, their thoughts, and join the debate in this. Again, if you're interested in signing up for any of the demonstrations and getting involved with the divestment campaign or any of the environmental work, there's people in the back if you've been convinced by the government side. And if you like the format of what we're talking about, there's brochures outside on the table outside, and you can come talk to any of us. We'll be out there for a little bit about debate at Rutgers. We want to thank the Climate Society and all our other co-sponsors for putting on this event, and everyone have a great night. So thank you.